Cervantes and the Birth of a Dream. Welcome. I am Melesias. Today, we are opening a book that laughs at the world, and in its laughter, reveals a truth so profound that it has echoed for over 4 centuries. It is the story of a man who read too many books, who looked at a world of dust and boredom and saw instead a universe of enchantment, chivalry, and heroic duty. He was not a young man. He was not a brave soldier or a handsome prince. He was Alonso Quijano, a gentleman in his 50s, from a village in La Mancha whose name the author pretends not to remember. A man with a modest estate, a niece, a housekeeper, and a brain that had dried up from too much reading of tales of knights-errant. One day, he did something absurd, ridiculous, and utterly magnificent. He decided to become a knight himself. We are opening Don Quixote by Miguel de Cervantes. Miguel de Cervantes Saavedra lived a life as adventurous and tragic as any of his fictional knights. He was a soldier, wounded in the great naval battle of Lepanto, where he lost the use of his left hand. He was captured by Barbary pirates and spent 5 long years as a slave in Algiers, attempting escape after escape with a courage that bordered on madness. He was a tax collector, a job that landed him in debtor's prison. And it was there, in the darkness and humiliation of a prison cell, that the first seeds of this story were planted. He knew suffering. He knew failure. He knew what it was like to dream of glory in a world that offers only pain. And from that bitter well of experience, he created not a bitter book, but a book of immense, generous, and heartbreaking humanity. Don Quixote was published in 2 parts, in 1605 and 1615, and it is considered the first modern novel. It is a book about the power and the danger of stories, about the line between madness and idealism, and about a friendship so deep and so unlikely that it has become one of the most beloved in all of literature. The book is not just a story. It is a dialogue, a mirror, and a trap. It pretends to be a translation from an Arabic manuscript found by chance in a marketplace in Toledo. The narrator, Said Hamid Benengeli, is himself a character, an unreliable Moor whose version of events Cervantes invites us to doubt. The story is full of interruptions, digressions, and characters who have already read the first part of the book that describes their own adventures. It is a novel that is constantly winking at the reader, asking us to think about what is real and what is fiction. But at its heart, it is the story of 2 men. The first is our knight, Don Quixote, a man who refuses to see the world as it is, who insists on seeing it as it should be. The second is his squire, Sancho Panza, a simple, greedy, loyal farmer who is slowly, beautifully, infected by his master's madness. Together, they ride across the plains of Spain, tilting at windmills and freeing prisoners, and in their conversations, the entire human comedy and tragedy unfolds. So, prepare your heart for a story that will make you laugh until you cry and then, quietly, break it. We are about to follow a man who is considered the greatest fool in literature, and we will discover, by the end, that he may also be one of its greatest saints. Let us ride out onto the plains of La Mancha. The adventure is about to begin. And it begins with a man, a name, and a horse. Part 1, The First Sally, A Knight-Errant is Born. The decision was made. The gentleman from La Mancha, Alonso Quijano, would become a knight-errant. He polished a suit of armor that had belonged to his great-grandfather, a rusted relic covered in the dust of a century. He spent 4 days inventing a name for his horse, finally settling on the magnificent, poetic, and utterly appropriate, Rocinante, a name that suggested both a humble nag and a noble steed. He then spent 8 days naming himself, transforming from a simple gentleman into Don Quixote de la Mancha. But a knight needed a lady, a peerless beauty to whom he could dedicate his victories. And for this, he turned to a farm girl from a neighboring village, a woman named Aldonza Lorenzo, whom he had secretly admired from afar. He gave her a new name, a name as musical and romantic as the wind over the plains, Dulcinea del Toboso. Her reality was irrelevant. In his mind, she was a princess without equal, the sovereign of his soul. And so, one morning in July, before the sun rose, he opened the back gate of his stable, mounted Rocinante, and rode out into the world, a knight in his own mind, a fool in the eyes of any who might see him. His first day as a knight was a disaster, and he was utterly delighted. He rode all day without a single adventure, which he attributed to some enchanter's spell. As night fell, exhausted and starving, he arrived at a small, squalid inn. But in his eyes, the inn was a great castle with 4 turrets and silver pinnacles. The 2 prostitutes at the door were high-born maidens. And the innkeeper, a fat, greedy man, was the lord of the castle. Don Quixote's greeting was so formal, so courtly, and so utterly insane that the innkeeper decided to play along for his own amusement. A bed was offered in the stable. And then, Don Quixote made his most important request. He begged the lord of the castle to knight him. The innkeeper, eager for a joke, agreed. The vigil of arms was to be held that night, a ritual where the knight would watch over his armor in the castle chapel. For Don Quixote, the stable was a chapel. He placed his armor on a stone trough and, with a fierce, holy concentration, began to pace back and forth, his lance in his hand. The illusion was shattered by a muleteer who simply wanted to water his animals and threw Don Quixote's armor off the trough. The knight, seeing this as a mortal insult, smashed his lance over the man's head. The innkeeper, panicked, quickly performed a mock knighting ceremony, mumbling some nonsense from a ledger book as if it were a holy prayer. He tapped Don Quixote on the shoulder with his own sword, and the deed was done. Don Quixote de la Mancha was now, in his own mind, a true and lawful knight. He rode away from the inn, his heart bursting with joy. His first act as a knight was to right a wrong. He came upon a farmer savagely whipping a young boy tied to a tree. Don Quixote, with a fury of righteousness, challenged the farmer, who swore on his knightly honor to pay the boy his back wages and stop the beating. Don Quixote, satisfied, rode off. The farmer, of course, waited until the knight was out of sight and then beat the boy twice as hard, leaving him half dead. This was the first, bitter lesson of the novel: good intentions are not enough, and the real world has a way of crushing the most beautiful of dreams. Emboldened, Don Quixote next encountered a group of merchants. He demanded they proclaim the beauty of Dulcinea del Toboso. The merchants, taking him for a madman, mocked him. Enraged, Don Quixote charged. But Rocinante stumbled, and the knight was thrown to the ground. One of the merchants, a rough man with a stick, proceeded to give Don Quixote a savage, merciless beating, leaving him broken and bleeding on the side of the road. It was a complete and utter defeat. The first sally of the knight-errant ended not in glory, but in humiliation and pain. A neighbor, a simple peasant from his own village, found him lying in the dust and, recognizing the poor gentleman, loaded him onto his donkey and carried him home. Don Quixote, delirious, was quoting old romances, convinced his misfortunes were the work of an evil enchanter. He was brought home to a house in chaos. His niece and his housekeeper were frantic with worry. They knew the books were the cause of his madness. While Don Quixote slept, the local priest and the barber, the self-appointed guardians of sanity, entered his library. They went through his books of chivalry, one by one, condemning them as heretical and dangerous. With a grim, puritanical satisfaction, they threw them out the window into the courtyard below. Then, they sealed up the library door and told Don Quixote, when he awoke, that an enchanter had come on a cloud and stolen not only his books, but the entire room. The cure for his madness, they believed, was to destroy the source. They were, of course, terribly wrong. The madness was not in the books. It was in his soul. And it was about to explode into the world in a way no one could have predicted. Part 2, The Second Sally, the Knight and the Squire. The destruction of his library did not cure Don Quixote. It inflamed him. A knight-errant without books was like a bird without wings, but his spirit was unbroken. He knew he needed a squire, and for this role, he turned to a neighbor, a simple, honest, and somewhat greedy peasant named Sancho Panza. Sancho was a man of the earth, practical, illiterate, and fond of proverbs. Don Quixote promised him the governorship of an island, a reward so dazzling and absurd that Sancho, after much convincing, left his wife and children to follow the mad knight. He mounted his beloved donkey, Dapple, and together, the tall, thin visionary on his skeletal horse and the short, round realist on his plump donkey, they set out on a second sally. This partnership, this collision of dreams and reality, of poetry and proverbs, would become the beating heart of the novel. For every windmill Don Quixote saw as a giant, Sancho saw a windmill. And yet, slowly, beautifully, Sancho began to believe. And then, they saw them. There, on the plain, stood 30 or 40 windmills, their great sails turning slowly in the breeze. But Don Quixote did not see windmills. He saw monstrous giants with long, swinging arms, a terrible army blocking his path. Sancho, in vain, pleaded with him to see reason. But Don Quixote, with a prayer to his lady Dulcinea, couched his lance, spurred Rocinante, and charged at full gallop towards the nearest windmill. He drove his lance straight into one of the great sails. The wind caught it, spinning it with immense force, shattering the lance into splinters and hurling both knight and horse into the air. They crashed to the ground, a tangle of broken wood and bruised flesh. Sancho rushed to his master's side. Don Quixote, dusting himself off, blamed the same evil enchanter, Freston, who had stolen his library, for transforming the giants into windmills at the last moment to rob him of his victory. This is the most famous scene in the novel, the moment that defines Quixote's madness. But it is also the moment that defines his heroism. He saw a threat and, without hesitation, attacked it. The fact that the threat was imaginary does not make his courage any less real. The adventures multiplied. One day, they saw two great clouds of dust moving across the plain. Don Quixote, in his fever, saw two mighty armies about to clash in epic battle. He described each knight, each army, in lavish, imaginary detail to the bewildered Sancho, who could only see the real source, two large flocks of sheep. Undeterred, Don Quixote spurred his horse and began attacking the sheep with his lance, killing as many of the enemy as he could before the shepherds, furious at this madman, pelted him with stones from their slings. One stone broke several of his ribs and knocked out several teeth. The reality of sheep had, once again, violently defeated the vision of armies. Another time, Don Quixote saw a barber riding on a donkey, wearing his brass basin on his head to protect his new hat from the rain. The knight, seeing the gleaming brass, was convinced it was the legendary golden helmet of Mambrino, a treasure of immense value. He charged, and the terrified barber, abandoning his basin, fled into the fields. Don Quixote placed the dented, humble basin on his head. It was not a helmet. But for him, it was the most glorious crown in all of Christendom. Perhaps the most profound misadventure of this second sally was the liberation of the galley slaves. Don Quixote came upon a chain of prisoners, condemned to hard labor on the king's galleys. He saw not criminals, but men being forced against their will. With a sense of righteous justice, he challenged the guards, defeated them, and set the prisoners free. He then demanded that they present themselves to his lady Dulcinea to report his noble deed. The prisoners, led by the vicious and ungrateful Gines de Pasamonte, were not the grateful knights he imagined. They were thieves, murderers, and cutthroats. They refused his demand, and when he insisted, they pelted him and Sancho with stones, robbed them, and fled into the hills. Don Quixote's greatest act of justice was rewarded with the basest ingratitude. The chivalric code was again shattered against the hard rock of reality. Driven by shame and pursued by the Holy Brotherhood for freeing the prisoners, Don Quixote retreated into the remote Sierra Morena mountains. Here, he decided to perform a penance, a beautiful distraction, in imitation of the great knights of old. He stripped off his clothes, did somersaults in his underwear, and wrote bad poetry on tree bark, all for the love of his unseen Dulcinea. He sent Sancho with a letter to his lady, a mission that would eventually lead to his capture and return home. The madman, in his lonely, wild act of devotion, had become something strangely moving. He was no longer just a fool. He was a pilgrim of love, a hermit of chivalry, a man who had, in his complete divorce from reality, found a strange, fragile, and utterly human beauty. The second sally ended, as the first had, with capture and defeat. The priest and the barber, along with a beautiful young woman named Dorotea, enacted an elaborate ruse. Dorotea disguised herself as the Princess Micomicona, a damsel in distress from a distant kingdom, who begged the great knight Don Quixote to grant her a boon, to slay a giant who had usurped her throne. Don Quixote, ever faithful to his calling, swore an oath to help her. Lured by this fiction, he was placed in a wooden cage, tied up, and loaded onto an ox cart. The priest and the barber told him the same enchanter, Freston, was responsible for this imprisonment. And so, the knight of the sorrowful face, defeated but not broken, was carted back to his village, his second sally at an end. The world was simply not ready for his brand of holiness. Part 3, The Third Sally, The World as a Stage. A month passed. Don Quixote seemed, on the surface, to be recovering his sanity. But the flame of chivalry was not extinguished, it was merely waiting for a spark. That spark came in the form of a visit from a young, mischievous scholar named Samson Carrasco. Samson brought with him astonishing news from the outside world. The adventures of Don Quixote and Sancho Panza had been published in a book. Their fame, he declared, had spread across all of Spain. People were reading about the windmills, the galley slaves, the penance in the Sierra Morena. Sancho was baffled and delighted. He could not understand how a historian could have possibly known all the details of their private adventures, unless they had used some kind of enchanter's art. Don Quixote, for his part, simply accepted it as the proper fate of a great knight. He was not mad. He was now, officially, a legend. And a legend must continue his story. The third sally had a very different character. The world was no longer an empty stage waiting for Don Quixote to fill it with his imagination. The world had read his story, and it was determined to become his co-author. The people they met now were not accidental witnesses to his madness, they were an audience, eager to play along, to manipulate, to mock, and, in some strange cases, to be transformed by the encounter. The most significant of these was a pair of wealthy, idle, and cruel aristocrats, the Duke and Duchess. When Don Quixote and Sancho arrived at their estate, they were not treated as madmen. They were welcomed as celebrities, given a lavish reception, and invited to stay as honored guests. The Duke and Duchess had read the book, and they were determined to stage their own sequel. The Duke and Duchess orchestrated a series of elaborate, cruel, and breathtakingly imaginative pranks. They created an entire fictional universe for their guests. They sent Sancho to govern his long-promised island, which was, in reality, a small, landlocked village called Barataria. To everyone's astonishment, Sancho proved to be a wise and just governor. He judged disputes with a Solomon-like simplicity, relying not on legal knowledge but on common sense and a generous heart. He was not corrupted by power. He was, for a brief, shining moment, the perfect ruler, a testament to the innate wisdom of the simple man. But the pressures of the fake kingdom, the endless demands, and a mock military invasion were too much. He resigned his governorship, declaring famously, "I was not born to be a governor. In this job, I realized I didn't know a thing. Better a poor, simple Sancho, with my dapple and my freedom, than a governor of any island in the world." He had passed through the fire of power and had emerged, not consumed, but purified. While Sancho governed, Don Quixote remained at the ducal palace, a prisoner of his own legend. The Duke and Duchess, with a cruelty born of boredom, orchestrated his greatest humiliations. They convinced him that Dulcinea del Toboso had been enchanted and that the only way to disenchant her was for Sancho to give himself 3,300 lashes on his bare backside. The noble knight was tormented by this, and Sancho, his loyal squire, was outraged. The love that had launched 1,000 adventures was now a bargaining chip in a game played by aristocrats who had no understanding of what it meant to truly believe in something. The final, decisive blow came not from a giant or a phantom army, but from a mirror. A young knight, the Knight of the White Moon, challenged Don Quixote on the beach of Barcelona. The armor of this knight gleamed with a cold, pale light. It was Samson Carrasco, the scholar who had first brought them news of their fame. He was no longer playing a game to cure Don Quixote. He was here to end the story, once and for all. He had come to defeat him in single combat and demand his unconditional surrender. The two knights charged. The clash was brief and brutal. Don Quixote was thrown from Rocinante, defeated and humiliated before a vast, silent crowd. The Knight of the White Moon stood over him, his lance pointed at the fallen hero's face, and demanded the terms of the duel. Don Quixote must return home, lay down his arms, and abandon knight-errantry for a full year. The man who had tilted at windmills, freed prisoners, and dreamed impossible dreams, was finally broken by a calculated act of reality. The third sally ended there. The Knight of the Sorrowful Face, the champion of Dulcinea, the scourge of giants and sheep alike, was led home in silence. The year of penance had begun. The flame of his madness, which had burned so brightly for so long, had been extinguished. And now, in the quiet of his village, with the books he loved sealed away and his imagination finally conquered, the real tragedy was about to begin. The tragedy not of a knight-errant, but of a man who had lost his dream. Part 4, The Return to Reason and the Death of a Dream. They returned to the village on a Sunday, at midday, when everyone was in the square. The people saw the two figures approaching. Don Quixote, no longer in armor, was carried on a litter, his body broken by fever. Sancho Panza walked beside him, his head bowed, his eyes red from weeping. The Knight of the Sorrowful Face, the scourge of giants and the champion of Dulcinea, had come home. The children ran to tell their parents. The housekeeper and the niece rushed to prepare a bed for the defeated hero. The village, which had once mocked him, now watched in a strange, uncomfortable silence. There was no laughter. Only the heavy, quiet weight of an ending. They laid him in his bed, in the room where his books had once lined the walls. He was consumed by a fever that lasted 6 days. The priest, the barber, and the young scholar Samson Carrasco visited him constantly. Sancho never left his side. He sat by the bed, holding his master's hand, his face a mask of grief. He tried everything to lift his spirits. He promised him new adventures, new battles, new glories. He told him that Dulcinea was free from her enchantment, that she was waiting for him, that the giants were gathering again on the plains. But the fever would not break. And then, on the 6th day, Don Quixote fell into a deep, long sleep. When he awoke, he looked at the people around his bed with eyes that were no longer clouded by dreams. His voice was weak, but his words were clear. "My friends," he said, "I am no longer Don Quixote de la Mancha. I am Alonso Quijano, whom men call the good. The mercy of God has opened my eyes. The books of chivalry are false. My madness is gone. I see the world as it truly is. The people in the room were stunned. They had spent the entire book trying to cure him of his madness. And now that the cure had come, it felt not like a victory, but like a death. The madness had been his soul. It had been the thing that made him different from every other dusty, forgotten gentleman in La Mancha. Without it, he was just an old man dying in a bed. Sancho, who had been the most loyal of all, was the most devastated. He had followed a knight. He had believed in a dream. And now, the dream was being denied by the very man who had created it. He fell on his knees and, with tears streaming down his face, begged his master not to die, but to live for more adventures, to live for the promise of the island, to live for the enchantment of the world. But Alonso Quijano, the good, was firm. He could not go back to the dream, even if the dream was more beautiful than the reality. He dictated his last will and testament. He confessed his sins to the priest. He asked forgiveness from everyone he had wronged. And then, he turned his face to the wall. The fever, which had loosened its grip for a few hours, returned with a vengeance. And on a quiet morning, with Sancho at his side, Alonso Quijano the Good, who had once been Don Quixote de la Mancha, the knight of the sorrowful face, died in his bed. The greatest madman in literature, the man who saw castles where there were inns, and armies where there were sheep, and a princess where there was a farm girl, was gone. The knight had become a man, and the man had died. Epilogue, the legacy of the Knight of the Sorrowful Face. And so, the story of Don Quixote de la Mancha came to an end. Sancho Panza, who had followed a madman and learned to love him, was left alone with his proverbs and his donkey. The village returned to its dusty, quiet routines. The books of chivalry, the cause of all the madness, were burned or forgotten. But the dream did not die. It passed from a single, solitary night into the bloodstream of the world. Cervantes, the one-handed soldier, the former slave, the debtor, created a character who was, in his own words, lean, shriveled, whimsical, and full of thoughts never before imagined. And that character, in his absurdity and his nobility, has outlived every empire, every war, and every other book of his age. What Cervantes understood, and what we feel in our hearts even now, is that the world needs its Don Quixotes. It needs people who see the windmills as giants and the inns as castles. It needs people who believe in justice and beauty and love, even when all the evidence of their senses tells them they are fools. The real madness, the book seems to whisper, is not in dreaming. It is in refusing to dream at all. The story of Don Quixote is not a satire to cure us of our illusions. It is an elegy to a man who had the courage to live by them. I am Melesias. This has been the story of Don Quixote, the Knight of the Sorrowful Face, as I have understood it. Thank you for listening. If this long and beautiful journey has moved you, please subscribe. And the next time you feel the world pressing down on you, the next time someone tells you that your dreams are foolish, remember the man who tilted at windmills. Remember that the most ridiculous thing in the world is also the most noble, to see the world not as it is, but as it should be. Until next time.